What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. We'd also like to give a special shout out to one of Not Your Average Meta's generous patrons, Martin Stanley, for everything he's done to help out the channel. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we have a game featuring a couple new commanders from the Commander Matchup precon decks. This week's matchup features Jacob returning playing his Lagomos Hand of Hatred Sacrifice deck, Patrick back playing Zhulodok Void Gorger from the Eldrazi Unbound precon, Falgro playing his Saga Tribal deck being led by Narci Fabled Singer from the Enduring Enchantments precon, and Foil back playing the classic Meren of Clan Toth. Now that we're fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Foil plays a Swamp for turn while Jacob plays a Proxy Urborg. Patrick plays an Urza Saga for turn while Fog plays a Brushland. Foil plays a Force for turn before paying 2 to cast a Sakura Tribuilder. Jacob plays a Swamp for turn and then pays 2 for an Arcane Signet, while Patrick draws for turn and then uptakes his Saga to the second chapter. He then plays a Waste and pays 2 for an Eldrazi Mimic. Fog plays a Swamp for turn and then keeps the 2-drop train going by casting a Cankerbloom. On his end step, Foil sacks Steve to go to his library and get a Force to put into play tapped. He then draws for turn and plays a Swamp before he pays 3 in order to cast an Ashnod's Altar. Jacob plays a tapped Geothermal Bog for turn before he then pays 3 in order to cast his commander Lagomos. He then goes to combat and creates a 2/1 Elemental token which he uses to swing at Patrick, dealing 2 damage, before he then goes to his end step sacking his token. Patrick draws for turn and then floats a colorless mana off of his Saga before he then sacks it to go into his library and get a Soul Ring to put into play. He then plays an Urza's Power Plant for turn and passes. Fog plays a Force for turn before he then pays 3 for the Restoration of Oganjo, which has him going into his library to get a Plains card to put into his hand. Foil draws for turn and then casts a Bastion of Remembrance, which has him creating a 1/1 Soldier token when it enters play. Jacob draws and then casts a Harmonic Prodigy before he then pays 2 more mana to cast an Idol of Oblivion. He then goes to combat, which has his commander triggering 2 times and creating 2 elemental tokens, which he uses to swing 1 at Fog and 1 at Foil for 2 damage apiece. He then taps his Idol in order to draw a card before he then goes his instep, sacking both of his tokens. Patrick just plays a Waste for turn. Fog plays a Plains for turn, then remembers to uptake his Saga, which he chooses not to activate. He then pays 4 to cast his commander Narci and passes turn. Foil draws for turn and then casts Rise of the Witch King, which has each player sacrificing a creature and each of his opponents losing 1 life while he gains a life. This then has him returning Steve from his graveyard to the battlefield before he once again sacks it to go get another land from his library. This also allows Jacob to activate his commander's ability, which has him go into Demonic Tutor a card from his library to put into his hand. Each of his opponents then lose another life from Steve going to the graveyard and Foil passes turn. Jacob draws and then plays a Swamp for turn before he pays 4 for a Rose Room Treasurer. He then goes to combat creating an Elemental token, which also creates him a Treasure token. He then swings his Elemental over at Patrick for 2 more damage, before he then taps his Idol, drawing a card, before he then goes to his end step, sacrificing his token. Patrick plays another Waste for turn before he then taps out and casts an Oblivion, so we're targeting Jacob. This then has Jacob exiling the top 4 cards of his library and Patrick put into play 2 of his lands. Fog draws for turn and then reaches the last chapter of his Saga, which has each of his opponents losing 3 life while he gains 3 life. He then plays a Canopy Vista for turn and then pays 5 to cast a Tale of Two Novelle, choosing to target his commander. Fog then goes to combat, swing his commander over Jacob for 3 damage while he gains 3 life. Foil draws for turn and then casts a Gorger Signet before he then uses the Signet to help cast his commander Meren. Kearney draws for turn and then casts a Mayhem Devil, creating a treasure token, before he then casts a Demon's Disciple, having each player sacrifice a creature when he enters play. This then has him dealing 2 damage to Fog and 2 damage to Foil. This then has him going to combat, creating another Elemental token, which he swings over at Fog for 2 more damage. He then uses his Idol to once again draw a card before he then goes to the beginning of his end step, sacking his token and activating his commander, going to tutor for a card from his library to put into his hand. Patrick draws for turn and then pays to cast all his dust, having each player sacrifice all the colored permanents they control. This then has all the permanents getting sacrificed and Jacob shooting Fog for 2 more damage. Fog plays a Force for turn and then casts Oath of the Grey Host, which has himself and Foil both creating a food token. Fog then pays 2 and casts a Fema the Cacophony, which has him exiling an enchantment from his graveyard and creating a zombie token on his end step. Foil draws for turn and then pays to cast a Talisman of Resilience, before he then pays an additional 2 to cast an Azumi Grave Robber. Jacob draws Return and then casts Sir Conrad the Grim before he then casts an Unearth, returning his Mayhem Devil to play from his graveyard, dealing 1 damage to each of his opponents. Patrick draws Return and then casts a Chromatic Orrery before he then uses the Orrery to help cast a Forsaken Monument. Fogg draws Return and then upticks his Saga, which has each of his opponents losing 3 life while he creates a treasure token. He then plays another Force Return and pays to cast a Nexus Warden, before he then pays 5 more to cast Tales of Master Sashiro, using the Saga trigger to put a 1/1 counter on Euphemia. He then gains 2 life off the Warden and goes to combat, swinging Euphemia over at Jacob for 3 damage. Foil draws Return and then taps out in order to cast his commander a second time, before he then sacrifices his Nezumi Grave Robber to create 2 colorless mana to help him cast the Demon's Disciple. This then has each player sacrificing a creature and a lot of death triggers going off, which ultimately has Foil going to 27 life, Patrick going to 23 life, and Fogg going to 27 life. Foil then returns Steve back to play off his commander and passes. Jacob draws Return and then pays to recast his commander a second time. He then creates an elemental token and decides not to attack anybody and sacks it at the end of his turn. Patrick plays a Waste Return and then uses the Chromatic Orrery to help him cast a Wormcoil Engine, gaining 2 life, before he then also casts a Scuttling Doom Engine and gaining 2 more life. He then pays to cast his commander Zhulodok, which gains with 2 more life, and he passes his turn. Fogg draws Return and then finishes one of his sagas, which creates him 3 tap Spirit tokens. He then upticks his second saga, which has him putting another counter on his Euphemia. He then pays to also cast his commander a second time before he then goes to combat, swinging Euphemia over Jacob again, this time for 4 damage. He then goes to his instep, once again exiling enchantment from his graveyard in order to create a zombie token. Foil draws Return and then taps out in order to cast Old Stick Fingers where X is equal to 5. He then reveals cards from the top of his library until he has 5 creature cards revealed, which he then puts into his graveyard, which triggers Sir Conrad, dealing 5 damage to each of Jacob's opponents. Foil then bottoms the rest of the cards and returns a Winding Constrictor from his graveyard back to play on his instep. Jacob draws Return and goes straight to combat, creating an elemental token before tapping his idol in order to draw a card. He then pays 1 and casts a Blasphemous Act in order to wipe the board. Foil then responds by sacking a bunch of his creatures to his Ashnod's Altar in order to create colorless mana and get a bunch of experience counters, which then has each of Jacob's opponents losing 3 life. The Blasphemous Act then wipes the board and has each of Jacob's opponents each losing 14 life. Patrick then creates 2 Wormcoil tokens off his Wormcoil Engine dying, and Jacob plays a Jet Medallion. He then sacks some treasures and has enough mana in order to cast a Dread Return, returning Sir Conrad from his graveyard to play. Patrick untaps Return before paying enough to cast a Darksteel Monolith. He then gains 2 life and pays to recast his commander a second time, gaining 2 more life. He then also casts an Ancient Stone Idol, gaining 2 more life, before he then goes to combat, swinging both of his Worm tokens over at Jacob. Jacob then decides to block one of them, which has each of his opponents losing 2 life, before he then takes 5 damage and Patrick gains 5 life. Fogg draws Return and then reaches the last chapter of his saga, which has the exiling and returning to play Sashiro's Living Legacy. He then plays a Force Return and pays 6 to cast Battle at the Hellbolt. This then has him exiling a non-land permanent from each of his opponents until the saga leaves play. Foil draws Return and then plays a Swamp before paying 4 to cast a Corpsejack Menace. He then pays to cast a Victimize, targeting the Fleshbag Marauder along with his own Demon Disciple in his graveyard to return to play by sacrificing the Corpsejack Menace. This then has each player sacrificing 2 creatures before he then passes his turn. Jacob draws and plays a Mount of Return before he then pays to cast a Zulapur Cutthroat and then an additional 3 to cast Braids, Arisen Nightmare. He then also pays to cast Rankle, Master of Pranks, which he then swings over Patrick for 3 damage. After damage is dealt, he then chooses the mode to have each player discard a card as well as each player sacrificing a creature. He then sacrifices his own Zulapur Cutthroat, which has each of his opponents losing a life. He then goes to his instep, triggering Braid, sacrificing an artifact, which has Foil sacrificing an artifact while Fogg loses 2 life and he draws a card, and Patrick also sacrifices an artifact. Patrick draws and then casts a Mana Geode, which has him gaining 2 life before he scries 1 card, keeping it on top of his library. He then goes to combat, swinging his commander over Jacob, who blocks with Braids. Fogg draws Return and then upticks his saga, once again exiling a permanent from each of his opponents. He then pays to once again cast his commander a 3rd time and pass his turn. Foil draws and then claims he's going to do something funny by casting an Unmarked Grave, going into his library to get a card to put into his graveyard. He then puts an Avenger of Zendikar into his graveyard before casting a Reanimate, bringing the Avenger back into play and taking himself out of the game. Jacob plays a Swamp Return and then casts a Dawn of the Dead. He then goes to combat swinging Rankle over Patrick for 3 more damage once again, and then chooses the mode to have each player sacrifice a creature. Patrick just pays to recast his commander a 3rd time, gaining 2 life. Fog draws for turn, and then his saga goes off, returning the permanents that it exiled back to his opponent's battlefields under their control. This then creates him an Avacyn token before he casts a Long Reach of Night, which has each of his opponents sacrificing a creature unless they discard a card. Finally, he casts a Dockside Chef and passes. On his upkeep, Jacob loses a life and returns Rankle back to play from his graveyard. He then draws for turn and pays to cast a Nadir Nightblade as well as a Murkward Bats. He then once again swings Rankle over Patrick for 3 more damage, and once damage is dealt, he chooses to have each player sacrifice a creature once again. Patrick draws for turn and then once again pays to cast his commander a 4th time, gaining himself 2 life, before he then pays to cast a Thought-Knot Seer, gaining 2 more life, targeting Jacob. Jacob then exiles the 1 card in his hand and Patrick passes turn. Fog draws for turn and then upticks his saga, which has each of his opponents sacrificing a creature. He then plays a Plains for turn and casts a Weatherseed Treaty, choosing to read ahead to the 3rd chapter. This then has him targeting Avacyn, giving her +3/+3 before he swings her over Jacob, who blocks with the Murkward Bats, but still ends up going down to 2 life. On his upkeep, Jacob loses another life and returns Rankle back to play once again. He then draws for turn and goes to combat, swinging Rankle over at Patrick for 3 more damage, and then chooses to have each player sacrifice another creature. Jacob then pays to recast his commander and passes his turn to Patrick, who draws for turn. Patrick then pays to recast his commander a 5th time, gaining 2 life, before he then pays to cast Ugin the Ineffable, gaining 2 more life. He then uptakes Ugin to exile the top card of his library as a colorless spirit token and passes his turn. Fog draws for turn and his saga goes off, having to exile and come back into play as the Animus of Night's Reach. He then pays to once again cast his commander. On his upkeep, Kearney decides to return his Demon's Disciple back to play, having each player sacrifice a creature before he then loses a life and dies. Patrick draws for turn and then recasts his commander a 6th time, gaining 2 life, before he then uses Ugin's downtick ability to destroy Fog's commander. At this point, Fog knows the game's over, so he untaps her turn and concedes to Patrick. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe in order to see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.